What's up everybody, my name is Jensen. Welcome back to another video, and today we're going to talk all about aperture, why it's important, and everything you need to know to capture better images. Let's get right into it. Okay, now aperture is the second essential part of the exposure triangle. Last we talked about shutter speed. And like I said before, today we're going to talk all about aperture. Next, I want to talk about what aperture is and what makes it so important. Similar to shutter speed, aperture is yet another way to control your camera's exposure, or in other words, how bright or dark your photo is. But in contrast to shutter speed, which allows you to change your exposure by lengthening or shortening the time of exposure, aperture allows you to control brightness of your image by physically opening or closing the opening of your lens. This means that with a larger opening, more light comes in, and a smaller opening, less light comes in. This obviously changes how bright your image is and how the exposure of your image turns out. Now, on the inside of your camera's lens, there are a series of blades. And depending on the lens, they're anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 and so on, different little aperture blades. And these blades, organized in a ring, are actually what open and close to change how much light is entering in through the lens. The number of aperture blades and how they're organized can affect how the out of focus areas look in your image. At first, getting a grasp of how aperture works and how the numbers and the size of the apertures relate to each other can be a little bit complicated. Now, it's typical that higher end lenses or more expensive lenses are able to open up their apertures wider when compared to lower end or less expensive lenses. For example, take a look at these two Canon lenses. They both have an identical zoom range, meaning the exact same range of focal lengths is covered in both lenses. However, this one that's quite a bit more expensive can open its aperture wider, and that aperture remains constant throughout the zoom range, whereas in this lens, the aperture effectively closes down as you zoom in. Now you might be wondering, why is this lens so much more expensive than this one? It can just open its aperture wider. But being able to open your aperture wider is valuable for a few reasons. Not only does a wider aperture allow you to gather more light, and thus increasing your exposure, but a wider aperture at any given focal length will also increase the amount of background separation. And this is where things get really interesting. Now, if you've studied photography at all, it's likely that you've heard the term bokeh. Bokeh is pretty much just a fancy word for out of focus. Bokeh specifically refers to the out of focus areas that are outside of your focal plane. Take, for example, these areas next to my head. The background behind me is far outside of my focal plane, meaning that it's going to be out of focus. Focal plane is not really a term that you use in everyday conversation, so let me explain it. Your focal plane is literally the slice of 3D space that your camera is focused on.
Now, in this video, and for the next minute or so, I use the terms focal plane and depth of field somewhat interchangeably. But I wanted to make sure that you and I both got it straight, so take a look at this diagram with me here for a second. On the left, you see a diagram of a lens, and the dotted lines stretching out from the lens are a representation of the camera's field of view, or in other words, everything that would be captured onto the camera sensor. Next, you see two solid vertical lines with the label beneath that says area of acceptable focus. The area of acceptable focus in this case is usually what is referred to as your depth of field. The larger your aperture is, the shallower your depth of field, and the smaller your aperture is, the larger your depth of field. In the middle of the bench, you can see another vertical dotted line. Above it is the label for focal plane. The focal plane is the location within the area of acceptable focus, or your depth of field, where the focus is the most precise or the most sharp. Objects slightly closer or slightly farther away from the focal plane may still be in focus, but they won't be as sharp as the areas that are on the focal plane. So for the rest of the video, when I say focal plane, understand that I'm talking about the area of your image that's in focus, or the area within your depth of field. Both terms are referring to similar things, but just keep that in mind. All right, let's get back to the video.
In a general sense, this means that everything from this front part of the slice to the back part of the slice is going to be in focus. The smaller your aperture number, or the larger your aperture size, means that your slice or your focal plane is going to be smaller. The larger your aperture number, or the smaller the actual opening of the aperture, means that your focal plane or the depth of field that your camera is able to focus on is going to be much greater. Like I said before, this is where things get really interesting. As you can imagine, changing your depth of field or how much of your image is in focus can have a huge effect on what your image looks like. As you can see right now at a 50mm focal length and f4, my face is in focus, but everything behind me, like these trees, are out of focus. Let's see what happens when I stop down that aperture to a larger number and a smaller hole, and we'll see what kind of effect that has on our image. Okay, now as you can see, I have all but disappeared from the image. Now remember that I said that when you increase your aperture number, meaning you decrease the actual opening or the size of your aperture, that lowers your exposure, meaning it lowers the amount of light that's able to make it through your lens and onto your camera sensor. So in order to use a smaller aperture like f22 that I'm set at right now, I have to change another element of the exposure triangle in order to compensate. In this case, I'm going to use my ISO. Now, I'm not really going to go into detail on exactly what I'm doing. I'll go into much more detail on ISO in my next video, but for right now, I'm going to crank my ISO way up, which will therefore increase the sensitivity of my image. Okay, starting at ISO 100, let's crank it up and see at what point my face is exposed correctly. Oh boy, yeah, so we're looking at close to 10,000 ISO in order to have my face exposed properly. Clearly I need some external lights or something else to make this a proper shot. Since I increased my ISO, there might be some extra noise here in the video, but don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to the background. Now there's still a little bit of difference in between the focus on my face and the background, that's inevitable, but take a look at how much more in focus these background trees and leaves are. The mathematics and the physics behind exactly why a smaller aperture, higher aperture number results in a larger depth of field and a larger, thicker focal plane is pretty complicated, so I'm not going to go into detail on that right now, but just understand that the smaller your aperture is, meaning the higher your aperture number is, the more of your image, depth-wise, is going to be in focus. And for another example, see how my face is in focus, but you can still see the detail in the bricks behind me. I'm still at f22 and ISO 10,000, but let's bring it back to f4 and see what the image looks like then. Okay, now I'm a ghost, but let me turn down the ISO real quick to compensate for that extra light that's coming into our lens so you can see what it looks like. Okay, much better. Notice how that depth of field and the focal plane has decreased dramatically. My face is still in focus, but you can no longer see nearly as much detail in the brick behind me. So yes, you can open up your aperture if you need more light in your image, or you can close it down if you have too much light to balance your exposure, and that's all well and good, but photography is all about creativity, and changing that depth of field opens up a world of possibilities when you're making your images. So what are the scenarios where you'd want a shallow depth of field using a large aperture and a small aperture number, and what are the scenarios in which you'd want a large depth of field with a small aperture size and a large aperture number? Let's talk about it. At the end of the day, remember, it's all up to you. It's your photo, you're behind the camera. The photo should end up how you want it to look. It's not my photo, it's not anybody else's, it's yours. So it's your choice what the photo looks like. Now, in terms of portraits, many people will decrease their aperture number, increasing their aperture size, and like you've learned now, that creates a separation between your subject, your focal plane, and the background, bokeh, out of focus areas. This separation is often pleasing and emphasizes your subject, as is usually the point when you're taking portraits. I would encourage you, however, not to open up your aperture all the way all the time when taking portraits. Varying your aperture can create more interest and variety in your photos, and sometimes that wide aperture is just too much. You'll end up missing focus and having your subject's nose in focus while their eyes are out of focus, and sometimes just having the front of their face in focus but not the back of their face, like their ears and hair in focus, isn't really the look that you're probably going for. So experiment and play around with different aperture sizes until you're happy with how your image looks like. Now, on the other side, when you're taking landscape photos, it's often desired that you have the greatest amount of your image in focus as possible. This means decreasing your aperture size, increasing that aperture number to something more like f8, f11, f16. That allows elements in both the foreground, the midground, and the background to be in focus all at the same time. I know that inverse relationship with the size of the aperture and the size of the number can be kind of confusing, but just remember that it's the opposite. The bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. The smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. I promise that in time you'll get used to it. One way that you can remember it is the smaller the number, the less of your image will be in focus, and the larger the number, the more of your image will be in focus. Okay, just 2 more quick tips, then we're gonna end the video. Oftentimes on the front of the camera next to the lens is a button that you can easily press with your finger, and without taking a photo, your camera will actually adjust the aperture blades to whatever aperture you have your camera set at, and that way you can check your depth of field through the viewfinder or on the screen on the back of your camera, and that way you can see what your image is gonna end up looking like. So you don't have to take a bunch of photos and check which ones you like most to see what depth of field you want to use for your particular subject. Secondly, every lens has a focus sweet spot within its aperture range. For most lenses, that ends up being around f8 or f11. That means that even with identical focus, you'll end up with a sharper image at f8 or f11 versus a wider aperture like f1.4 or f1.2. Now, I'm not talking about the background blur, I'm talking about the area of your image that's in focus. It's usually not a huge deal, but it certainly can impact your image. And when you're trying to get the sharpest image possible, you might have to stop down your lens a bit, meaning a smaller aperture and a larger aperture number. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please go out there, practice the things we talked about in this video. Get out there, take photos, and as always, please subscribe to see more videos just like this. Thank you.